Dawn scraped its pale fingernails across Winterfell's roofs and left the frost shining like breath held too long. The yard lay quiet except for the soft scuff of a groom's boots and the carrying clink of a bit ringed through a mare's teeth. Snow had fallen in the night and fallen again toward morning, and was now falling in a slow, steady sift that made sounds smaller. Smoke from the smithy dragged low in the frozen air and flattened above the old stones like a gray wool blanket. The weirwood in the godswood did not move, but the branches wore a skin of white, and the carved face looked out with red tears that had frozen and thawed and frozen again, a history written in resin. Jon stood in the covered walk above the yard with his cloak gathered at his throat. He'd been there long enough that the snow had traced the seam of his shoulder and the curve of his sword hilt before melting against the trapped heat of his body. Ghost stood with him, an unmoving brightness against the drab of stone and wood, eyes clean as winter stars. The direwolf's breath made two soft streams of steam that hung and then slid away like the smoke from the smithy. Jon watched the sky lighten to a thin blue that never quite reached the ground. He had slept poorly. He had spoken to the gods beneath the red leaves until the candle he'd brought burned out and the wax crisped into a pale shell, and still he had slept poorly. The words he had fashioned kept shifting their weight in his mind, stubborn as stones in a river. He had learned the lift and fall of vows since boyhood, learned the cadence of words that made a thing binding and the weight of silence that made it truer. He had said too many oaths that had arranged his life for him. He kept turning them over to see the faces of the men who had heard him the first time. Ghost nudged his thigh with a cold nose. Jon let his gloved hand find the thick fur of the direwolf's neck and scratched along the old scar. The feel of living strength steadied him, the way the feel of a ship's rail steadies a man and used to the tilt of the sea. In the yard below, a boy stumbled with a bucket, and a stable hand caught his elbow and saved the water. Jon's mouth shaped a grim smile that no one saw. Boots sounded in the passage behind him. Davos came into the pale light with his cloak thrown back and his face red from the air. The tips of his beard had caught snow that had not melted. He did not speak until he stood beside Jon, and even then he kept his voice low as if not to wake anything that ought to be left sleeping. "Storm's easing," Davos said, as if any man needed telling. "Won't matter once we're all inside and warm with opinions." Jon's smile moved enough to be seen now. "You promised me you'd say less this morning." "Did I?" Davos's eyes creased. "I've made a life of breaking such promises. It's kept me alive." They stood together in the hush, watching the yard fill in slow increments like sand poured into a glass. A courier crossed the gate with a new crust of snow on his shoulders. Somewhere a hammer began to beat iron into shape, measured and sure. The sound reached them as if through a thick curtain. "She'll not like it," Davos said. He did not say her name. He did not say dragon or queen. He did not need to. "She has a choice," Jon said. He did not say that choices were the cruelest edges a man can lay against himself. "So do we." Davos rubbed his hands and blew into them. "Do we? Only some choices come with more winter in them than others. You were a boy when the king in the north was a fresh song. Men have not forgot the end of it." He tilted his head a fraction toward the yard as if the snow might have ears. "Some won't forgive another start. The ones who stayed with the Boltons," Jon said. "The ones who sent letters to whoever looked most likely to keep them fat and warm." He meant it without heat. He could feel the place in himself where heat used to live, a pit that had burned clean and gone quiet. "We will not be ruled by the shape of old fears. Then it will be the shape of new ones," Davos said, and his voice was softer now, not arguing. "You've been dead, Jon. You've done things none of us can weigh. Me, I'll follow you for what you are now as much as what you were. But they're only men. They keep their own weights set to the lives they know." Jon did not answer. He put his palm against the stone of the parapet and felt the cold move through leather into flesh. He turned from the yard at last. "Come on," he said. "We'll be late to our own courage." They walked along the passage and down the tower stairs that were worn like a riverbed by the feet of men long gone. The hall waited, lit by dozens of tallow candles and a few good beeswax that Sansa had some way of finding. The rushes had been changed since yesterday, fresh straw with the sharp smell still in it. At the far end, the great hearth held a log thick as a man's waist, burning slow and throwing off the kind of heat that stands its ground for hours. The banners hung heavy with damp, colors dulled by the day. The dire wolf of Stark, the merman of Manderley, the bear of Mormont, each looked older in winter. Sansa was already in the high seat when Jon entered, though she rose when he crossed the threshold. Her hair was braided back in the northern way, and the breath of her looked like a veil in the cold. She had the ledger she loved tucked beneath one arm and a quill behind her ear, and there was ink along the base of her thumb. Jon sometimes thought that the side of her that knew the weight of grain and the exact count of nails in a barrel would save more lives than any sword. "They're waiting in the other hall," she said. Her words made no steam. She had warmed herself earlier. Then, "Lyanna's voice can carry through stone. We may not need to open our mouths." Jon studied her face. He always found something of their mother in her. It was not the lines or the mouth but the steadiness with which she held both. Her eyes searched his expression with a sister's right. She found nothing he had not chosen to show. "We could have called fewer," she said, and this time there was a question in it, or at least the shape of one. "We could have done this by letters and wax." "We could have," he said, "and you didn't."
"No."
He saw something ease in her shoulders, and with it the trace of a smile that acknowledged the thing between them, old as their father's voice. They went out together into the grey-lit corridor and from there to the smaller hall where the long tables had been pushed back to make room in the center. They had come. Lord Wyman Manderley with his heavy rings and his eyes bright as a fox's in a fat face. Galbart Glover, who could not keep his mouth from a certain bitterness even when he was in the right. Lady Alice Karstark with her gloved hands folded tight as a lock. Lyanna Mormont not yet 4 feet from the rushes to the top of her head, but holding herself as if the rest of them had shrunk. A clatter of lesser lords and their men. The voices rising and falling and then beating down to silence when Jon stepped onto the dais at the end of the hall. Jon had never liked a dais. He took the few planks of height without pleasure. Davos stood to his right, Sansa to his left, and the space between them felt to Jon like a good decision made. Ghost lay at the edge of the raised boards with his head on his paws, eyes half closed, the way he always did when rooms filled with more scent than sense. Jon did not bang a staff or raise his hand for quiet. It rose around him all at once, attention drawn not to a gesture but to the fact of him. When he spoke without ceremony. "Winter's here," he said, "not as a season, not as a word." He felt the men lean forward a little, the way men lean toward a fire in a room that still remembers cold. "You have all seen what walks in it, some more than others. I have died and come back with it in my throat. I have longed for the simple problems of men with crowns, and I have woken from that longing with shame." He let that sit. Davos had told him once that pauses are like doors. A man can walk through them if he doesn't fill the space with his own voice. "I went south to ask for help," he said. "I went to Dragonstone because a woman with dragons had dug her feet into that rock and said she would be queen. I found ore in her island and fire in her bones. I found men and women who think that if you bend your knee to the right person you will stand taller than your father. Maybe they think that because they have bent so long they have forgotten there is another way to stand." Glover's mouth went tight. Manderley leaned his heavy head in his heavy hands and watched Jon between his fingers. "I told her what's coming," Jon said. "I told her about the dead and the cold that burns. She wanted kneeling for her help. She wanted to count us with the rest. I looked at her and at the men beside her and the soft sea air and the walls that have never known a northern night, and I could not do it. I will not." A shift went through the hall like the small wind that travels ahead of a storm. Lyanna's chin had lifted a fraction even before he said it. Other faces went still with the first step of fear. Not of a dragon or a southern queen, but of the road chosen and the sudden lack of roads beside it. The North was a kingdom before the rest of them were stories in their mothers' mouths, Jon said. "We were bound to our kings by oaths that made sense because they were our oaths. We tried to be part of the rest and it almost broke us. It did break some of us. We were betrayed and butchered in a hall where the musicians hid knives in their sleeves and warmed them by the fire so they would not shock the flesh. He did not look at Manderley when he said that, but he felt the great lord grow smaller inside his chair. I will not ask you to follow another southern crown. I will ask you to make the North again what it was. Not for pride, for survival, for sense, for the gods. We will fight the dead. We will fight anyone who tries to keep us from fighting the dead as we know we must. We will trade with whomever will trade. We will take help from anyone who will offer it without a collar hidden in the purse. And we will kneel to no one. His voice had not lifted, but the last words found the timber of the room and sounded as if they had been meant for it. Ghost opened his eyes but did not rise. Snow pulling down out of the low sky freckled the shoulders of men near the doors. Before the murmurs could coalesce into words, Lyanna Mormont stepped out from the crush and walked into the clear with the blunt certainty of a knife that has done this work before. She did not wait to be called on. House Mormont has bled for Starks, she said. We bled when we were told to bend to Lannisters. We bled anyway. I gave my voice for you then, and I give my sword now. The North is its own, and we will be governed by men and women who know what it costs to cut wood in a storm. If a dragon wants to help, she can fly beside us without a saddle. A low laugh ran through the hall and died there. It was not mockery. It sounded like surprise remembered as something else. Glover's mouth worked. He was not a coward, Jon knew. He was a man made brittle by having been wrong twice and having lived where others had not. And when she brings fire, he said. When she flies above these old stones and says she will melt them down to teach us manners? Manderley lifted a hand and lowered it again. The gesture looked like surrender and was not. Then we will fight in water, he said with a ghost of a smile. Winterfell will be a lake and we will make boats out of our tables. Soft laughter again, but with more breath in it now. Jon met Glover's gaze and did not let it go. Then we put arrows in the dragon's eyes, he said. And if that fails, we run into the trees and learn again how to live as our grandfathers did. This is the place where people come to see if they can do a thing difficult and worth doing. We will not be frightened back into the arms of the people who made a game of our faith. Sansa's voice was quiet and reached the edges of the room anyway. The oaths need words, she said. Words that bind as much as steel where steel cannot go. If we are to declare the North apart again, we will set it down with the seals of the houses, with witnesses, with decisions made in the clear. If the dragons come, they will not find a handful of fool boys playing king. They will find a kingdom whose accounts are in order. That Drew smiles the way a sudden break in the clouds draws light. Manderley lifted himself to his feet with the care of a man moving a sack of grain that happens to contain himself. White Harbor stands with Winterfell, he said. We have quills. We have old laws that remember older ones. We will dress your declaration so it leaves no gap for a southerner to slide through. But we will also need ships and salt pork and hammers by the dozen. You cannot feed a new kingdom on cleverness alone. We have the veil, Sansa said, and Jon thought she had saved those words to throw them like a rope at the right time. For now, Lord Royce knows where his bread is buttered, and it is not on golden plates. Alice Karstark stepped into the open with the small caution of someone coming forward in a room where her family name still drew weather with it. If we are kings again, she said, are we also all at peace with each other? Or do we rip ourselves open as a first course and leave the dead to dine on the scraps? Jon looked at her and felt the memory of the young boy whose head had weighed too little after the rope took it. He had done things in order, and the order had cost more than he had thought possible. House Karstark is part of the North, Jon said. As much as Mormont and Glover and Manderley. Old wrongs will stay old. We have too much to do with new ones. He saw Sansa's jaw go still at that, remembered her sharp, quiet disagreement over that same question not so long ago. He did not look away from Alice. We have made terms in this hall before. We will keep them. Davos finally moved, a step only, then spoke with the care of someone throwing water on a fire in hopes of dampening it without putting it out. Then set the words to the page, he said. Give us the marks to make our children remember. We've all the fight in the world coming for us. Let's not start it with our tongues." They did not clap or cheer when the decision hardened. This was not a Southron tourney. Men nodded and turned to their stewards. Scribes unfolded the thick paper and set ink to warm by the hearth. Manderley produced a seal box with a flourish and a wink that was half apology to a memory only he fully held. Sansa leaned over the table with a look that combined satisfaction with the wary start of the long arithmetic to come. Jon put his name where it must go and felt the scratch of the quill like a small wound he had chosen. By midday, the snow had quickened and the world outside the hall looked like wool pulled loose by an angry hand. Men came and went through it with heads down, believable as crows. Jon took an hour with the men in the yard, another with the smith, another in the rookery with Maester Wolkan listening to the drift of ravens like black leaves in a winter stream. Ghost paced everywhere his master did, without sound, an understanding shadow. When he finally stole himself away to the Godswood, the silence inside it was a different species. Snow did not fall the same way under those branches. The air held a minute of time that was not like the other minutes. Bran was already there, sitting on a root thick as a horse's back, his chair drawn close to ease the cold in his bones. He watched Jon arrive, and his face showed nothing of a boy's pleasure in seeing his brother. Jon had learned to take that as kindness, not as distance. The things Bran had seen seemed to have burned a kind of shine out of him. "You chose the path you were walking," Bran said. He said it as fact, not as praise. "You've been on it since the first time you swung a practice sword at Robb and didn't like losing." Jon breathed once, shallow, the cold entering like a small knife and leaving the same way. "I liked watching him win," he said, "but I hated the way it said something about me that I didn't choose." Bran put his hand on the bark in a way that looked like prayer and like a pledge. "Names change the shape of a thing," he said. "You've lived with too many that were borrowed. This one is one you made." Jon had not meant to ask. He had told himself he would not ask. He had promised himself he would wait until there was nothing pressing that a truth could knock from its place. The words left him anyway. "What else do you see?" he asked. His mouth was suddenly dry. "Do you see if this breaks us? If the dragons do come?" Bran's eyes went unfocused for a long breath. Then they sharpened as if he had stepped through something on the other side of the trees. "I see ice boiling like water," he said. "I see a wall of river that does not break when it meets stone. I see fire that doesn't give light and men with crowns that are only wounds. I see you at the base of a cliff with a rope in your hand and too many people shouting advice. You don't climb the cliff if you listen to them. You climb because your hands know what your ears do not." Jon made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had found more air. "That's not much of an answer." Bran tilted his head. "It's what the trees have today." Jon sat with him until his fingers hurt enough to make him stand again. He left his brother with the weirwood's face and went back into the day the way a man goes back into a fight after his throat has been made wet again. By nightfall the ravens had flown. The letters had been sealed with wax that held in it the flavor of an old season. Bees and warm leaves. One went to Dragonstone with careful words that Sansa had cut as if from thin metal. One went to the Eyrie with language as dry as a ledger. One went to White Harbor to ask for stores that would be paid with lumber and men and, failing that, with honor. Jon read each of them and put his name to them and felt the weight of wax where it cooled. He ate little at dinner. The stew tasted of good bones and stale beer. Lyanna Mormont told the story of a bear that came too close to a woodcutter's camp, and the boy who had tried to be braver than sense and had died nearly for it. She told it as a lesson to someone who did not take it in. Men laughed in the places they were meant to laugh. Jon watched Arya's place, empty still, and felt a fold of hope with a stitch of pain in it. She came 3 nights later. He came back to himself walking toward the yard without having decided to move, Ghost ahead of him in fast, sure leaps that sent up soft fans of snow. The gates had just opened, and the wind rode in with a small thing in dark clothes on a small horse crusted with the journey. Arya slid down from the saddle and stood a moment to speak softly to the animal and then turned her head. Her face was not a child's and not something else yet either. The sight of it took Jon's breath under his ribs and wrung it. "Little sister," he said, and then he had his arms around her and felt how spare she had become. She laughed without sound against his cloak and hit his shoulder once for the lie of that word. They sat together later by the kitchen fire where the ladies did not go, and the old cook had a private pot she always claimed wasn't ready. Arya held a wooden bowl between her palms and watched the single great log burn down in layers of white coals. Jon studied her profile as if the sight could make more time pour between now and the next fork in the road. "Sansa says you've made a kingdom," she said at last. "Bran says you were always going to make whatever you were making." "I don't know what I've made," Jon said. "Not yet." "You've made trouble," Arya said, and she smiled with a thin and honest edge. "That much I can see without gods or books." He told her about the words in the hall and the seals and the messengers and the look on Glover's face that had felt, for the first time, not like contempt but something that might, in old age, become respect. She told him about weather and lands he had never seen and a woman with a thin mouth who would have slit Arya open for asking the wrong question in the wrong room. When she mentioned the thin mouth again, Jon could see the moment her eyes went somewhere else, a place with a table and a shadow in it. He hid his fear in another mouthful of stew and let her come back on her own. "Do you think the Dragon Queen will fly here?" Arya asked. She said it as if a dragon were a hard thing like a wall of ice or the truth about a murder. "I don't know what she will do," Jon said. "Tyrion will try to make her do the thing that makes sense. I don't know if that has ever been a man's job or if it is always only the job of the world itself." Arya raised her bowl and drank, set it down empty, and wiped her mouth on her sleeve in a way that made some part of Jon happy in a place that did not often feel happiness these days. "If she comes," she said, "I will look at her. I will look hard enough to see what she looks like under her name." The raven came the next day like a piece of black ash from a distant fire. Sansa took it up herself. She broke the wax and read fast, then tracing a line again slow as if speed had misled her. She laid it down and looked at Jon with a face stuck between mischief and anger, two tools she had learned to put to work when kindness had been pointless. "She's sending her hand," Sansa said, "and a woman with a mind like a spun blade, and a knight with a sword that has loved her for a long time. The queen herself will come if they send back the right words." She tapped the letter with a fingernail that made a small, mean sound. Her words are polished but heavy, like a mace someone has learned to disguise as a prayer book. "She does not like this." "Good," Jon said, surprising them both. "Better to know it." "You will need to say the right things," Sansa said. "I will say the true things," Jon said. "If those are not the right ones, then we will learn that sooner too." The day they came, the sky had the look of iron that has hardened and forgotten it was ever molten. The first the North saw of them was dragon shadow that crossed the yard like a cloud running, and the second was the sound like wind stuffed into a bellows and forced out a narrow mouth at speed. People ran to the doors and then stopped running out of a self-preserving habit that said a dragon's shadow might not be the worst of it. Two of them circled the tower top, one green with wings the color of old copper, one black with edges that swallowed light, and their breath sent steam into the air that made the world look briefly like a pot boiling. They did not land in the yard. They took the field north of the walls and set their claws in snow and dirt and lowered long necks as if to drink. Tyrion Lannister rode under the gate on a dun horse with a beard heavy enough to square his face. He looked unafraid in the way a man looks unafraid when he has eaten more fear than he can digest and learned to wear the smell the way other men wear perfume. Missandei of Noth rode beside him with her head wrapped against the cold in wool that did not look southern, and Jorah Mormont came behind with his old seat shoulders squared and a face that was stiff around the eyes. Sansa met them at the top of the steps, Jon a half-step behind and a half-step to the side. He and Tyrion looked at each other and in an instant exchanged a dozen ghosts of sentences they did not say. "Lord Tyrion," Sansa said, her voice free of any tremor the man might have wanted to hear. She did not incline her head enough to do more than keep the snow from gathering on the tip of her nose. "You look less like a Lannister in the snow. That may be the first kind word the North has sent my way," Tyrion said gently. I'll hold it to my chest to keep the rest of me warm. They went into the hall. Ghost paced them all the way, refusing the lazy slope of the low fire for the unkind stones where strange scents gathered. Missandei's eyes moved the way the eyes of a careful reader move along a line of ink. Yora's eyes did not leave Lyanna Mormont once she stepped from the knot of Bear Island men. There was a pain in his look that had nothing to do with dragons or queens. They took wine because it would have been rude not to, and they warmed their hands without showing pleasure because that was how people lived in this place. Tyrion got to his business as if he were a man with a sudden small window in which to do something essential before the wind blew the shutters in again. She sent me to tell you 3 things, he said. The first is that she intends to break the wheel. I have told her often enough that wheels mend themselves as soon as they can. She says she will break it until it cannot be mended. The second is that she will help you fight the dead whether you bend the knee or not if I can convince her that it is not a surrender to common sense. I will try. The third is that she will not tell the story of a northern king to a world that is about to go looking for stories with swords. She cannot allow another crown to rise while she is also trying to keep the old ones from cutting her hands. If the second is true, the third matters less, Sansa said. If the second is not, the third is only a prettier name for the first. Pretty names are what keep old men alive when they've chosen sides badly, Tyrion said, and he smiled as if at his own expense. You will not kneel. I will not, Jon said. Tyrion watched him a long time as if the answer lived behind Jon's eyes and the thing he had heard was only a shadow of it. You were always a stubborn man, he said. I admired it then because it made for interesting nights and fewer fools in great chairs. I admire it now for reasons that will probably get me killed later. Missandei set her cup down with both hands. Her voice had the kind of clarity that doesn't so much carry as make men want to set other noise aside. You believe you owe your people a shape that looks like them, she said to Jon. She believes she owes the world an end to a story where one kind of people stand on the backs of another kind. Then perhaps we do not owe each other anything at all, Sansa said, and Jon felt the sharpness in her like the kiss of a knife's edge run along a thumb. Yora finally spoke. His voice deeper than his father's had been but carrying the same gravel at the bottom. My queen is not a cruel woman, he said. She believes in herself because she had to. She will go further for a promise kept than for a field stolen with pretty speeches. I don't want her field, Jon said. I want my people to live. I want them to be able to live as themselves after they do. If she wants to be a queen that looks like something new, she can be the first to make room for another crown that doesn't bend to hers. Tyrion's mouth pressed tight and then released. I can carry that, he said. I can carry anything if it has sense in it. The question is whether sense has ever been enough to turn a dragon's head. You may get your answer in the field north of your walls if we do this wrong. Or you may get it at your table if we do it right. He glanced at Sansa when he said that last. They stayed 3 days. They watched the smith's hammer iron along frames that would hold dragonglass if they ever got any. They counted sacks of oats and sighed and counted again. They spoke with the Manderleys, and Tyrion smiled at Lord Wyman as if he were shaking hands with a man whose other hand might be in his pocket. Missandei walked the godswood and laid her palm against the weirwood with a face that was careful not to give offense to a god she did not know. Yora stood alone by the practice yard at dawn and looked west, and if he thought of Bear Island his face did not show the shape of the thought. At the end of the 3rd day, a rider came in from Last Hearth with the kind of speed that makes people move aside faster than their minds tell them to. He had 2 blue fingers and a cut on his cheek that had not been made by any blade forged by a man. He did not wait to be brought before anyone. He shouted the news as soon as his mouth had air to shape it. They walked the lake, he said. They walked where there was no lake yesterday. They march not north now, but down the spine of the world as if they mean to pry it open. They have giants at the front and wolves without tongues. They have our dead with their boots still on so we know them as they pass. The room moved without noise. Men looked for their spears and then remembered they were not there. Sansa closed her eyes, opened them, did not allow any visible piece of her to shake. Jon felt the decision in his bones settle deeper. He turned to Tyrion, who had gone very still. "She will come," Tyrion said. "I'll send a raven with words that will make her see the shape of this. She will come, and if you tell her what you told me, if you speak not of pride but of sense, she may be more than you think she is. And if she is not?" Arya asked from the hall's shadow. She had put herself where shadows came easily. Tyrion did not look at her when he answered. "Then we shall find out how far men can run without their souls. They moved like a city that has practiced for a fire but never had one. Some drills become habit, the rest become noise." Sansa and Manderly set the charters in a chest and tied it with leather and wrapped it in oilcloth against accidents that might make ink run where Seal had said it would not. Jon sent Tormund a message with a map of places to fall back to that had ground as good as men could hope for. He sent another to Castle Black with a phrase that Ed would recognize and no one else would think anything of. He sent a third to the Eyrie with words that positioned duty as the best of shields a man could hold before his pride. Missandei wrote to her queen in a hand that would have made any scribe nod, and Tyrion wrote under it a set of lines that did not repeat any of the ones above but turned them like keys in slightly different locks. Yora added a single sentence that, when Sansa read it, made her lift her head and blink as if something had blown dust in her eyes. He had written only, "I have seen what they will make of your name if you stay away." The dragons came on the 5th day with a sound like cliffs being broken down by a long sea. The people of Winterfell poured onto the walls with the old fear and the new hope making a strange mixture in their throats. Snow flurried up and away from the beats of gargantuan wings, lifting in sheets like cloth torn from a bed. Daenerys Targaryen did not come into the yard on a litter. She slid down from the bone ridge of the Black Dragon's neck with a soldier's efficiency and walked over stone that had known older queens and no queens. She wore no crown. The fur at her throat was the color of smoke at the end of the day. Her eyes registered the cold and refused to be changed by it. She looked at the castle and at the faces on the wall. She looked last at the Godswood, though she could not see the heart tree from where she stood, and Jon wondered if she knew what she was looking at. They met in the great hall with too many witnesses. They met again in the small room off the solar with almost none. The first meeting was for show and said what these meetings always say: "I am not afraid. I am not a fool. I recognize the places you choose to hide your fear." The second was for truth, and even then truth came with its own costume. "Your letter was bolder than your last request," Daenerys said. Her voice was lower than Jon remembered. "Winter changes the register in which people speak. You told me what you wanted not as a petitioner but as a neighbor who knows his fence line." "I told you what was true," Jon said. She moved to the small window and looked through the wavy glass at the yard. Men below dragged a sled with beams on it. A boy ran with a message he clutched in his teeth to keep his hands free. Daenerys put 2 fingers on the glass and looked at the way they made those men's shapes unsteady. "You refuse to kneel because you say your people need the shape of themselves," she said. "I broke chains. I burned men because they had owned men. I told myself I did it because the world needed to be made into a shape where that was no longer possible." "You want to break a wheel," Jon said. "I want to keep my people from being ground under it while you lift your hammer." Daenerys turned back to him. Her eyes were not kind and not cruel. They were the eyes of a person who has come too far to think that kindness and cruelty will do all the work by themselves. "If I say I accept your independence now, every lord from Sunspear to the Trident will declare his own kingdom and claim I invented it for him," she said. "You will have your north and I will have 100 petty kings and 500 petty wars and 10,000 petty graves. If you say you accept it after we win," Jon said, "you will have a friend with a kingdom in the only place that matters if the dead come again. And you will have something else to show the men you say you want to free. That power can set itself a boundary and live inside it." They stood in the cold of that small room and listened to the noise of Winterfell working itself into a shape that could take a blow. Daenerys reached for the chair and sat as if the act itself had to be taught to her body in cold places. "I did not come to rule Ash," she said, softly enough that the window was the only witness besides him. "I did not come to see another queen's father's hall smoke out of its own history. I came because my hand told me something that I did not want to hear, and because each time I have listened to him, I have been kept alive a little longer. I will fight with you. I will not ask you to kneel before we do it. I will ask you not to say king while we do it." Jon felt the slow press of a long breath fill him and leave again. He nodded, and the nod seemed to weigh as much as some decisions he had seen men make with swords. "Fine," he said. "I'll say Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North as often as you need to hear it. I'll say those words like a blessing." He stepped closer without meaning to. The cold in the room seemed to lay a finger through him and touch bone. "What I say to my people in the Godswood is between me and the trees. That is between you and your gods," she said. Something in her face moved then, not a smile but a loosening. "When this is over, if it is ever over, we will talk again where there is a river and no snow in it." They both looked at the door as if someone had knocked. No one had. The feeling was just that of a threshold in a room that had not had one a moment earlier. The preparations that followed were the kind that occupy mind and body so completely that fear has to make do with the corners it can find. The dragons took the air and practiced setting piles of wet wood alight until the wood behaved. Men gathered from as far as they could walk before frost stiffened their ankles and made their lungs wheeze. The free folk came in through the forest with faces as red as berries and eyes that held in them the memory of a night sky full of strange lights. The smiths learned to sleep in shifts that took half their anger and turned it into iron. Sansa and Lord Wyman invented a new table to keep track of a new sort of sum. How many hours a man could dig before his hands would not close over bread. Arya tested men quietly with wooden swords in out-of-the-way corners and then told them little essential things. "Turn your foot here, do not blink there, do not let the sight of what is coming steal the movement you need to make to live." Gendry arrived with a cart and a grin that cracked when he saw her and then disappeared again into work she brought him. He forged a spearhead with a socket of his own design and handed it to her with a look that did not need words. She twirled it once and said nothing because the tip had its own voice. In the rookery, Wolkan grew old in a week and did not complain, not because he loved the North or the Starks particularly, but because men who have lived most of their lives among birds know better than anyone what it looks like when a sky is trying to say something that a man would be a fool not to hear. On the wall that looked north, they built fires spaced along it like beads on a thread so men could find their way in a white world when white things were trying to kill them. On the field, they dug the first set of trenches and then a second farther in and then a third where they hoped it would be needed last. They filled brazier circles with oil and covered them so that a man afoot would not fall in and burn himself to screaming. They carved runes into wood because there were men who believed such things mattered and men who did not, and there was no sense in choosing which man would get his wish. Jon slept when a man weaned on winter sleeps, suddenly and anywhere. He woke with the names of dead men in his mouth and with his hand already reaching for a sword he was not holding. Each time he woke like that, Ghost lifted his head and put it back down again as if to say that the world remained the world for at least another breath. Bran came to him one night not with a vision but with a map. He drew it on the table in charcoal with a hand that had learned not to shake while the rest of him learned stranger things. He showed where the dead had moved last and where the rivers ran and how the wind sometimes made lyres of trees. He tapped once hard enough to leave a darker mark by a ford that the maps did not name and said only, "Here." Jon looked at the dot with the weight of an army pressing down inside his chest like a stone you cannot spit out. He nodded and said, "All right," as if a brother had asked him to hold a door while he tied his boot. The morning of the first sighting, a man on the far ridge raised a horn to his mouth and could not blow it because his lungs closed with the shock of what his eyes had found. He tried again and made a sound like the last note of a song someone had dropped down a well. Others took it up, men who had not seen anything at all yet, and the sound went along the line like a fox along a fence. Jon stepped out into a light that made no promises and felt the world lean. They came as a color first, a shadow that moved wrong beneath the sky, a dark you saw not with your eyes, but with the part of you that had kept your great-grandfather alive through a winter he didn't speak about. Then shapes resolved inside it. The extremes always come clear first. Giants, 2 abreast and 3 deep, the color of ice pulled from a river's bottom, will stiff as armor. Behind them a crowd vast enough to make men count without numbers. The world warped around them the way air warps around heat. Davos stood at Jon's shoulder. He lifted his chin and let it fall. "I've looked at many mistakes," he said. "I never saw one this organized." Jon did not laugh. He raised a hand and kept it still. The archers on the wall raised the irbovs. The dragons spiraled down from where they had been waiting in the high, cold air where their bodies did not spend themselves so quickly. The black one screamed in a way that sent snow cascading off old, bowed boughs. The green's breath made a cloud that moments later turned to laughter in the throats of men who were not going to live long enough to tell their children about that sound. Daenerys came to stand at Jon's other side as if it had been decided by someone they could both agree with. She did not speak the thing that would have been easy. "Are you afraid?" She asked the question that mattered. "Now," she said. "Not yet," Jon said. "Wait until we can catch more of them in the first trench. Otherwise, we'll be feeding your breath to the wind." She nodded once. Her hair had caught snow and held it like jewels. She mounted when he did, not because they were part of any ceremony, but because men in fields who see the people making decisions on their feet do better than men who do not. They rode along the line and passed it to the men dug in at the first trench. Tormund bared his teeth at Jon in a grin that showed no humor and a good deal of something else. "I thought you were dead," he shouted. "I was," Jon said. Tormund's grin stiffened, then deepened. He clapped Jon's shoulder hard enough to bruise and turned away to shout at a man whose spear held a strip of cloth that had come loose and looked like an invitation to get his hand caught in it when he least needed that to happen. The first ranks of the dead did not run. They came on with the helpless momentum of a thought a mind cannot stop thinking. When they reached the lip of the trench, they began to fall in. When enough had filled it, the rest walked over those bodies as if they were a road. Jon gave the signal. A line of men moved as one, and the oil they had poured and covered flamed up in an instant to a heat that felt like a hand thrown against a face. The screaming that followed had nothing of humanity in it, and yet made the hairs on men's arms stand up as if it did. They held the first line. They held the second. The field became a place of smoke and sudden light and the kind of screams that live afterward in men's chests like coughing. The dragons came in low and long and set great arcs of the dead alight. They rose again in a clatter of wings and a sound that made the dead pause as if even they remembered something older than themselves. Daenerys rode her dragon like a woman who had learned to become the shape the world had made for her. She did not look theatrical, and Jon realized with a shock that she did not need to. Men who looked up saw theater anyway. Toward evening there was a lull sudden as sleep. The dead paused as if to wonder whether the living would forget what they were doing if given a moment. Men drank quickly from leather bottles and pissed where they stood and did not apologize. Jon wiped the flat of his blade and did not notice he was doing it. He turned to find Daenerys standing without a dragon beside him, breath ghosting in the cold, hair loose from its bindings in a way that made her look for the first time like a person rather than an emblem. "How long will this last?" she asked. "As long as a winter," Jon said. It was not an answer. It was the only answer he had. She looked past him to the line of the godswood, the heart tree a pale wound in the dark. "Your people," she said, and then stopped. She tried again, and the second sentence had different bones under its skin. "Our people will need to know what words they are going to live by," she said. "If we live, whether those words are written with crowns or not." Jon looked at her then and saw in her face a willingness to be judged later as long as she could act now. He recognized it because he felt it in himself, because he had felt it since the night he took his vows and later when he broke them and later still when he died of them. He nodded once. He did not say anything because there was nothing that would not sound like compromise when spoken in a time when compromise could be mistaken for weakness and weakness could get men killed. Night came late and then all at once. The cold sharpened as if it had been blunted by the work of the day and had now regained its edge. The dead moved again, the kind of movement that makes a man feel that perhaps he had imagined the pause. Men lit torches and discovered again, as the first men did, that fire makes a place of its own inside darkness. The dragons rose and became only darker shapes against a sky that had run out of light. Bran sat under the heart tree with his eyes rolled back into the white that had frightened their mother when she had seen it the first time in a fever. Arya stood not far from him with her spear, and when a white came from a place no one had expected one to come, she did not call. She moved, and the thing fell into two pieces that did not stop moving until salt was thrown on them. Sansa walked the wall with Lord Wyman and Lord Glover and pointed without fuss at places where men were standing in the wrong way to be ready. She did not speak the word queen, and no one offered it to her. The other women of the castle did what they had done when this place was not a castle but a hill fort. They mended, they warmed, they kept children from making themselves into problems. And when the dead clawed up from under a crypt grate that some mason in the long past had not fitted well, they killed what they had to kill with the same hands that had turned bread. Toward midnight, the black dragon fell from the sky like a cut piece of night. He did not hit the ground. He took the earth like a man taking a knee before rising again, blood steaming from a gash along his shoulder that would have been a death wound on anything else. Jon saw the shape of the wound and the way the dragon held it, and his mind made a list without his consent. What they had, what they needed, what they were about to lose. He ran. He did not run because he thought his feet would save anything. He ran because the body sometimes knows what to do when the mind is too full. He reached the place where the dragon had come down and met Daenerys at the same moment. Her hair was blown across her face, and she had a cut along her cheek that had bled and been frozen and bled again. She put her hand on the black scales and did not look at her hand. "Hold," Jon said to the dragon, the way he would have said it to Ghost, and felt foolish. The dragon's great eye rolled and focused and then unfocused again, and he did not know what that meant. He looked at Daenerys and saw in that instant how thin the line is between a queen and a person who loves a thing that is hurt. He put his hand on her shoulder. She did not throw it off. She did not lean into it. They both stood and watched the dragon breathe. Around them men were still dying and killing and making ugly mistakes they would not live long enough to be ashamed of. When the dead finally fell back a second time, it was not a victory. It was weather. Men sorted it into piles of meaning because that is how men live at all. Jon went to the wall and stood and watched the far ridge where the dead had gone. He felt the pull in him, the tug toward the south he had felt before, the tug toward the godswood that made his mouth salt inside, the tug toward a peace he had never known and sometimes feared was only a word like any other. Davos came to stand beside him again, as if they had agreed to meet by the old well in a village where neither had been born. "You did what you said you would," Davos said. "That's rare. Dangerous, too." Jon made a sound that might have been agreement. He put his hand on the stone of the wall and felt the cold hum through his bones. The dead would be back with the morning. The living would, too, unless morning found a way to make thieves of them. Behind him, in the hall, the charters lay in a chest with the oilcloth still wet where snow had found it and been brushed off. Sansa would sleep for an hour because there were still numbers to be made in the morning that would not care how brave a man had been in the night. Arya would lie with her eyes open and feel the breath move in and out of her chest as if it were the most complicated craft in the world. Bran would be awake looking at a river that had not yet been found by any man who had a name for it. Tyrion would write another letter to a woman who had given him leave to try, and if the letter failed he would find another tool and try with that. Daenerys would sit with her dragon until the cold made her fingers useless, and then she would sit longer to teach the cold that it could not have what it wanted from her. Jon kept standing until the dark began to take color from the edges in a way that made everything look like a sketch before a master lays paint. The north would be its own or it would be ashes. He had made the first part of the choice, the part that was words, and the world had answered with things that were not words. He had never believed that the gods listened, but he had learned to talk to them anyway, if only because men need something to say when they are afraid that makes them less afraid to say anything at all. He closed his eyes just long enough to see the face of his father as he remembered it rather than as the world had told him it should be. He opened them to the snow and the slow, ineradicable noise of men at work in a place that had decided to live. He did not kneel. He did not say king. He did not have to. The old stones knew what he meant. The dead would learn it soon enough. The morning came like a white blade pulled from a sheath too quickly. The dead did not wait for men to finish their breakfast. They came out of the line of trees with the same patient hunger they had the day before, and the day before that, and whatever day had counted as the first of their days. The dragons went up slowly, as if even fire learns to be careful in a place that wants it dead. Men took their places, and for a few heartbeats there was a quiet that sounded like the inside of a church where no one believes and everyone goes anyway because it's what their fathers did. Jon took his sword and raised it and brought it down. The first rank moved. The second rank waited. The third rank looked as if it wished to be the first and knew it would die of that wish. He found Davos again without looking, and then lost him to the forward surge of things that need doing that are not in any man's control. Sometime in the untraceable middle of that day, a horn blew from the south, a long, level note that said nothing and everything. Men turned their heads like birds do when a sound is not one they know. Over the rise behind Winterfell, where the road cuts down toward the White Knife, riders came, their banners unfamiliar to some, too familiar to others. The Vale had emptied more than anyone had expected, and men from the Neck with mud frozen on their boots clattered up behind them, and behind those the strange square standards of White Harbor's guilds. Sansa had sent the right words, and men like Lord Royce and Wyman Manderley had done what the world required of them regardless of what it had required yesterday. Jorah Mormont rode into the press without a cry. Missandei stood at the wall and handed men water in cups she had washed in snow. Tyrion fought a foolish impulse to count numbers that could not be counted and instead told a frightened boy he was braver than any lion he had ever known. Arya moved and did not stop moving. Bran's fingers dug into bark. The black dragon breathed and winced and breathed again and learned for the first time the stubbornness of this cold land, and then grew to love it in the way we only love the things that hurt us and do not leave. By dusk, the field looked like a history that would take poets 100 years to lie about and still not get wrong. The dead fell back again with a frustration that could not be named because it had no throat. Men fell where they stood and were carried into the warmth and made warm or not, and women stood with their hands red up to the wrist and told the living to move aside and the dying to say what they needed to say quickly. Jon walked the line and felt every place he had been hurt since he had been a boy, awake and protesting and then quiet again. When it was finally full night and the dead had gone not very far but as far as they would go, Jon found himself back at the Godswood without having decided to go there. The Weirwood's face looked the way it always had, which meant it looked different every time. He stood beneath it and let the red sap identify him, if that is what it was doing. He did not ask for anything except maybe what any man asks for when the thing he loves is about to be taken from him by the work of his own hands. Daenerys came into the clearing with steps that were not careful and not careless. She stood without touching the tree, which struck Jon as a kind of respect he had not expected. She looked at him as if he were a question that had a different answer each time it was asked. "When this is done," she said, "we will speak your words and mine again. I will bring my crown if you bring your trees." "I will bring the North," Jon said, and he meant it not as a boast but as a promise to something that had not asked for it. She nodded. She did not hold out her hand. She did not bow. She looked up at the pattern of red leaves against the night and then turned and left. Jon stood a long time after that, as men do when they have had a conversation that changes nothing and everything. The snow fell light as ash and then heavier and then in sheets that reminded him of white cloth hung to dry in the great hall when he was a boy. He remembered being called to dinner by a voice that would not call anyone again. He remembered the feel of Ghost's fur when it was new and he had not known yet that it was the texture of a future he could not see. He remembered that he had chosen this, that he had stood up on a few planks in a warm hall and told men with good boots on their feet that he would not put his knee to a stranger's floor. He felt no pride. He felt a kind of rightness that had nothing to do with victory and a great deal to do with belonging. The North would be a kingdom again or it would be a graveyard. It would be itself either way. Jon turned his face up to the snow and let it collect on his eyelashes until he had to blink. Then he went back to the wall. He had work to do, and the dead were good at keeping a man from doing it if he forgot to keep moving. Snow had a way of teaching men how small they were without insulting them for it. It fell steady in the days that followed, a curtain with no seam, and each flake found a place as if a patient hand arranged them one by one. The field beyond the walls bore the story of 2 long days in its churned skin. Burnt patches cupped like black hands, trenches glazed with a thin, glassy rind where fire had licked oil and left a sheen, drifts over dead things that rose into humps and then sank as if the ground had swallowed. Men moved more carefully now, not because they were afraid, though they were, but because the body learns the pace that keeps it whole when haste cannot. At dawn, John walked the inner rampart where the wind tugged at his cloak and left a fringe of frost along the edge of his beard. The stitch at his ribs where a spear had pressed too close complained in a dull, honest tone. Ghost padded ahead and behind and sometimes beside, a white current that threaded the slow mill race of people and orders. The dragons had taken the sky early and cut a wide circle above the wood as if, from that height, they could understand the dead in a way men could not. Their shadows swung and returned and swung again. The sound of them had begun to seep into the castle's stones, so that even when they were away the air seemed to hold a pressure ready to become thunder. Davos joined him with an apple that had been kept in straw, its skin wrinkled and deeply sweet. He held it out without speaking. John took it and bit. The taste jolted him with a memory of warm months and a boy who had not yet learned what an oath can do to a life. "They're quiet," Davos said. "I never thought I'd hope for noise as proof the world is still moving." "They learn," John said. "So do we." "Learning's dear," Davos said. He meant the cost and the value both. He rubbed his hands and looked down where Missandei had gathered a dozen boys too young for the line and was teaching them to knot cords for slings. She spoke with patience and a calm that did not have to be forced into being. A small girl with a red cap watched from the threshold, miming the movements with her fingers. The sight steadied something in John that had been urging him to run. By midday, a ribbon of men wound down the White Knife Road. The Vale's steel-gray line, shields bright with frost. Lord Bronzeyon Royce rode at the head with his jaw set and his eyes in that place men go when they have not forgotten their dead but cannot carry them openly. Sansa met him in the yard with Wyman Manderly looming at her left and Robert Glover at her right like two different kinds of warning. Tyrion came forward also, slightly bent against the cold and smiling as if he had expected less and was pleased to be wrong. Royce dismounted stiffly and bowed his head to Sansa the way an old soldier acknowledges a standard in a wind. "Your letters were not poetry," he said. "I find I prefer that. The Eyrie will hold, but we could not sit the whole war out like hens on high perches." He glanced at the dragons circling, then back, and the flicker of superstition in him showed and vanished. "We brought grain, hard bread, pickled beef. Not enough, never enough. But more is coming if roads hold." "They won't," Wyman said, almost cheerfully, "but some will. We'll make boats of sleds and sleds of boats as needed." He clapped Royce's forearm with a heavy hand. "We'll put your pride on salt pork and teach it to like the taste." They laughed with breath and teeth and then set to their lists. The yard became a map of intent. Will ruts, shouts, the thud of heavy sacks, the drag of sled runners over packed snow. John walked among it not as a lord surveying work, but as a man who needed to see that the world still had edges he could reach and touch. In the hall, Sansa had commandeered a side table and turned it into a small country governed by ink. Missandei sat with her, conferring over a sheet where lines had been laid for an agreement most kingdoms would not have words for. The heading was simple, compact for the defense of the living. Under it, provisions for sovereign North and allied crown. "It will not be signed by her yet," Tyrion said mildly, standing with his hands tucked beneath his fur-lined sleeves, reading upside down with the ease of a man who had always had to steal glances. "But if she needs to, she could. And if she never needs to, the words will exist anyway, which is its own kind of magic." "Words have cut deeper than steel in this hall," Sansa said, not unkindly. "They might as well do us a kindness once." Missandei lifted her quill. "Mutual defense without hierarchy," she read aloud, crisp as a bell. "Open trade at parity rates. Safe passage to southern ports. No levy or tithe. Warden in the north to be sovereign within northern bounds. Crown in the south to be sovereign within southern bounds. Dispute settlement by appointed envoys, 2 and 2 with a neutral tiebreaker at need." She glanced up. "I can make it prettier if pretty will help." "Make it harder to wriggle from," Wyman rumbled. Pretty is what you put on a cake when you hope no one can taste the flour was damp. It will need something more, Tyrion said. An image, token. Men are children enough to need a thing they can hold in their hands that tells them the world has agreed. A coin, Sansa said immediately. 2 faces, a wolf and a 3-headed dragon. A coin minted once only when the dead are gone. We will melt it down afterward and make cups for children. So every time they drink, they'll wet their lips with the idea. Wyman stared at her as if she had reached into his mind and stolen something he had been saving to impress people with later. Then he smiled in the way men smile when they recognize a worthy opponent and also a friend. We'll do it, he said. White Harbor has dyes enough for 100 kings' faces. We can cut a new one that will show the world we chose to be clever for once. Jon listened and found that the discomfort he had expected did not come. He had not wanted to play at symbols. But if the fight with the dead was a matter of iron and fire, the fight after would be a matter of memory, and memory eats symbols or starves without them. When the council ended, he found Arya in the small yard by the old well, sitting on the low wall with needle across her knees and a strip of leather in her teeth. Snow stuck in her lashes and melted and stuck again without complaint. Gendry stood with his sleeves rolled and his breath a steady flag, turning a spear socket in the vise so the fit would be exact. You look like a girl at her needlework, Jon said, and held up a hand out of habit to ward the blow he knew would follow. It did. She smacked his shoulder lightly and showed her teeth. My needle makes tidy seams, she said. I don't leave threads where they can catch. Gendry nodded solemnly, eyes never leaving the iron he coaxed to his will. She stabs straight, he said. It's almost restful to watch, until it isn't. Arya tied off the leather grip and leaned the spear to her shoulder. Bran told me you're not sleeping, she said, not as a question. Stop listening to the voice that says there is a thing you can think now to make the fight tomorrow easier. There isn't. Only eat when the bowl is in your hands and sleep when you find yourself sitting with your eyes closed. I will, Jon said. You won't, she said and slid off the wall. But I said it. So if you die, they can say I tried, and I'll cut the throat of any god who tries to make me a liar. He watched her go, a bare shape in the soft fall of snow, and the place in his chest that had been tight since the first raven arrived loosened a finger's width. 2 days later, a train of low sleds slipped out of the mists of the north as if grown from them. The men who came with them were muffled to the eyes in greens and dun and whatever color the marsh wears when it wants to disappear. Their leader was slight and rangy and moved with that economical grace some woodsmen have, everything locked tight inside as if to keep from making ripples in the world. He paused beneath the gate and lifted his hand in a greeting that was old enough not to belong to anyone. Sansa gave him the courtyard and the dignity of silence long enough for men to measure one another with their eyes. Then she went to him and put her hands around his wrists the way kin do when they have not seen each other for a lifetime but shared a single hour that mattered. Howland Reed, she said, you are welcome here. He bowed over her hands and straightened and looked at Jon with a frankness that did not challenge. You have your mother's eyes, he said, and your father's way with choices that leave only the true thing. I thought you'd be taller, he added, and the smile that moved his mouth was not unkind. Jon found himself grinning back. I thought I'd be dead, he said. We were both wrong. Reed's men brought bundles bound in oiled cloth. When they unwrapped them, the hall filled with the mineral smell of fresh-carved obsidian. The shapes were strange at first. Frog spears with multiple prongs, darts with thin stems and swollen bellies, arrows whose barbs had been sharpened to fine translucent points. Howland picked up one of the frog spears and spun it once in his hand. Dragon glass behaves like a reed, he said. It likes to split when a clumsy hand tells it to bend. But if you learn how it grows, you can talk it into the shapes you need. He set the spear down and tapped a map with a long finger. You will not hold them in open fields forever. You'll bleed them with fire, and they will learn to go around the places that smell of oil. When they do, they will find the low ways, old riverbeds, deer paths, the folds where hills were argued into being. You will meet them there with things that know those ways. These, he touched the darts. Throw into the places where their joints pretend to be bones." He spoke without the weight of his knowledge crushing the breath out of the room, and in a little while the northern lords who had not known what to make of him stopped glancing at Sansa to see whether they should pretend respect. They gave it to him because he gave them work that fit their hands. That afternoon Bran came to the solar with charcoal on his fingers and an urgency he did not often wear anymore. He sketched the river lines with quick, inaccurate strokes and then set the piece aside, impatient with the limits of his body. "They've found the ford," he said. "The one no one uses because it's always filled with rocks the size of horses. It isn't now." The cold made it smooth. He tapped hard enough to smear the map. "Here." Jon and Sansa leaned in. The place was a bend of the White Knife where the bank cut high to the west and the east broke into low ground with a copse of birch that always, in summer, wore a gray coat of gnats. Bran looked past the map with his mouth closed in a stubborn line. "I can see the things they move to watch us," he said. "But not him. He stands where the air slides away from the light and he pulls the cold like a net. If you go, don't listen if the wind says your name. It won't be me." Jon glanced at Sansa. She nodded in the way that had become their call to action. "Wyman can break the ice upriver," she said. "If he sends boats up under the cover and brings them down with the thaw, we can put more water into that low ground than a horse can find its feet in." Wyman stretched his lips away from his teeth. "We'll flood them like rats," he said. "My father taught me the river's old tricks. She'll do it if we ask nicely and feed her afterward." "Feed a river?" Tyrion said, curious and tired. "Bodies," Wyman said, and the humor went out of his face. "And stones, and the memory we want carried to sea. The White Knife eats what we give her, and for a while she carries the taste to ships that don't know our names. They moved that night because night meant less to men who could not die of it than to those who could." Wyman's crews went up the black water with poles that could find the bottom, and men who knew when not to cry out as ice gave way beneath a foot and a son or cousin disappeared without a ripple. They set fire along the banks where brush would catch. Not because the dead would fear an edge of flame, but because the heat would make water run where it needed to run and trick the ice into a stiffness that would split at the right moment. The Vale sent pikemen who knew how to plant feet and not give ground. The crannogmen moved like parts of the marsh itself, rising and falling in the gaps between the living and the dead with those curious frog spears in their hands and their faces calm as if they were retrieving fish from a shallow pool. Jon went on foot. He did not say it aloud, but he had learned that a horse spends a man's luck in a way the man cannot control, and he had a little luck left he wanted to lay out himself. Tormund went with him because he had decided to outlive every man who ever told him he needed to be quiet. Davos came because he had a sailor's cussedness that made him walk toward anything that looked like a storm with a line in his hand. Jorah rode with the Bear Islanders, a dozen hard, tired people whose eyes made Lyanna look older when she glanced at them. At the bend, the world held its breath. The river ran black and fast under a lid the moon had silvered. On the far side, the birches stood in a line like men pretending to be trees and not very good at it. The dead filled the low ground in a wide shallow bowl that would have been excellent for barley if not for what it held. They did not look up. Their attention was a pressure that sat on Jon's chest as if it had weight. Wyman lifted his arm, dropped it. Men with long poles shoved at the slabs they'd scored earlier and the ice began to move. It lifted in quilts and then broke into plates and then into shards and then into knives. The sudden rush pushed the river onto the low ground and across it, water rising around dead ankles and knees. The first to lose their balance did not cry out. They simply went under and were replaced at once by those behind. In the lamplight it looked like earth heaving itself into new shapes. "Now," Jon said, and the first rank went forward with ropes and hooks. They pulled sudden bridges into place and dragged them back before a dead thing could set a foot. Men with torches flung oil-soaked swaddlings into eddies where the water circled itself and turned fire inward. The green dragon came low and blew a long, narrow breath that laid a bright strip across the flood. The dead turned into smoke that smelled like old wool and nothing. Jon kept moving, the whole world narrowed to a slice in front of him and the knowledge of feet at his back. He went down once and clawed back up with his hands and did not lose the sword because he had trained the hand to be tighter than the mind when the mind failed. Tormund saved a man from White Harbor and then tried to shake the gratitude out of him on the spot for wasting breath. Yora threw his weight into a rope and nearly went into the flood when something on the other end pulled like an ox. Lyanna barked a command that made two boys leap together and drag man and rope hand over hand until the thing in the water let go. When they pulled the hook free, they saw it had lodged in a giant's shoulder, and the giant's face lifted once and fell, and the mark of the hook in the flesh smoked where the dragonglass had touched it. The flood did not stop the dead. It parted them and confused them and made them stumble, and that was enough. The living slid away, not proud of what they had done but not sorry either. The river lowered as if her throat had been released. Ice began to knit along the edges as if a seamstress had come with a quick needle hidden in her sleeve. Back behind the line, Howland Reed sat with a spear but in the snow and breathed as if measuring the air for stories. He watched the men return without triumph and felt the shape of something old stir in him. He looked at Jon and saw a man who would never make a song of his own deeds and thus might deserve one. They slept in pockets like warm thoughts hidden between cold ones. They woke to a sky that promised nothing because that is what honest skies do. Sansa read the numbers and hated them but did not blink. She sent the old and the very young south with Vale escort because if a queen would not be a nursemaid, she could at least be a courier. Missandei stood in the yard and taught her numbers to girls with blue fingers and boys with faces too thin. Yora moved through the slow bustle and stopped when he found Lyanna alone by the west wall. Her hands shoved under her arms as if to keep them from doing something foolish. "You're my cousin," he said quietly, not knowing exactly why he had decided to say it. "I was not much good at being that. I'm trying to be better at the things I still have time for." She turned her face to him without softening. "My mother says you shamed us," she said. "My mother says a great many true things and one false thing on this subject. The false thing is that shame is a permanent stain. It isn't. It is a dye that leaches out in cold water if a person keeps their hands in it long enough." Yora bowed his head to a child who had been asked to be older than she was allowed and had accepted it. "I have kept my hands in," he said. "So I see," she said. "Go keep your queen alive. If she lives long enough to hear me speak, I'll tell her I prefer her breath warm and her dragons above the trees." Toward evening of the same day, the crypts behind the heart of the castle breathed out a ribbon of cold that had not come from the air. A boy carrying torches down to replenish a sconce let one drop and did not hear it strike. He stepped forward and the world shuddered under his feet and then rippled again like a sheet being shaken by unseen hands. Arya heard it as a change in the silence rather than as sound. She ran, a thin streak through the passages, spear at her back, needle at her hip, breath quick and clean. When she reached the steps, two men from the kitchen stood at the top with their mouths open and their hands lifting like children asked for something they did not have. She slid past them, took the steps low and fast, and found the seam in the night. It had opened where a grate had been mortared too lightly 300 years earlier and not checked into. A smell came through from soil that had kept secrets and did not want to give them up. Hands found edges and then the edges gave, and a thing without a face wedged itself through, shoulders squeezing, fingers hooking. Arya didn't yell. She stepped in and put the spear point where the thought was, and then put it again when the first strike took the movement and left the intent. The head split along a line that did not bleed. The body wrung itself against the new shape and then lay still, hands still complaining as if bodies after death resented the decision more than they had in life. Sansa arrived with two women carrying stones wrapped in cloth and a boy who had taken a poker from the oven and not asked permission. She did not order Arya back or forward. She watched the seam and breathed through her nose and lifted her chin as if she were about to call a dog in out of the rain. When the next thing came, she put the wrapped stone into the boy's hands and guided them both as they moved together to break the shape's wrists, so it could not pull a third time. Missandei came with salt and scattered it in a patient line across the threshold, as if she were teaching a stubborn pupil to read. "Where I was born," she said, almost conversationally, "there were stories about the dead who wanted a second taste. Salt and language were the answer to them. Salt to bring them to themselves. language to tell them where to go. "Tell them now," Sansa said. Missandei spoke 7 lines in a soft tongue no one else there knew. The air seemed to shift as if a door had been opened in a room with no wall. The next hand that found the grate let go as if it had been promised something somewhere else. Jon came at last with Ghost and 3 men with chains meant for cages that had once held bears too thin and angry to be safe. They set the chains where stone and old earth met and hauled until the grate came back into its socket. They set wedges. They set more wedges. They backed away and listened. The quiet that followed did not feel entirely like a victory, but it was a quiet in which people could speak and be heard, which is the first requirement for any kind of living. Afterward, in the kitchen where steam made a little heaven between men and their aches, the old cook ladled broth with grease eyes swimming on top and frowned at Arya's cut knuckles. "You children need to be told to mind your hands," she grumbled, dabbing with a cloth that had not been cleaned that morning and did not need to be now. Arya let her. Sansa sat with her bowl and stared into it as if the liquid arranged itself into the future when watched. Missandei, seat on a barrel, plaited the hair of the small girl with the red cap, and the girl counted each pass of the strands and made a game of it. News came crawled on its belly through the snow 2 days later from the south. Cersei had not marched. She had sent no grain, no men. She had sent, perhaps, a prayer to a god she did not believe in, that the winter would eat her enemies and come to her door sated. Tyrion read the letter from an old contact in the capital with no expression and then folded it and placed it in the fire, not because anything in it was secret, but because he did not want to keep the shape of those words in this house. "She's done what she always has," he said. "She chose herself and told herself she was choosing the world." Daenerys listened and said nothing for a space long enough to be mistaken for calm. When she spoke, it was with a care that made Jon turn toward her fully without meaning to. "The wheel will break under its own weight sooner or later," she said. "I would have preferred to count to later with both hands. We will do it with one." Jon could not stop a small twitch of a smile. "You are already speaking as if the coin has been minted," he said. She looked at him, and for a moment her face showed the person beneath the queen as clearly as ice shows the stone under it when the sun is strong. "I am learning to think in more than one future at a time," she said. "Your sister is teaching me it, whether she means to or not." That night the wind rose. It crawled around corners and ran along the roof beams and died in a whistle and then came again like a new creature trying the same door. Men little and large in their beds turned and pulled blankets up and thought of summer in that private place where they store their hope. Ghost prowled until dawn, the snow on his coat making him look like something carved and dusted for display. Jon slept and dreamed of a path through birch trees and the sound of water falling onto rock. When he woke, Bran was sitting in the chair beside his bed as if he had grown there. His face was more boy than god today, which Jon found comfort in without knowing why. "He wants the tree," Bran said without preamble. "He wants the memory inside it. He wants to press his cold into the rings and climb down into the earth that way. He remembers being kept out once. He does not like being told no." Jon sat, pulled the blanket away, put his feet on the rushes, and waited for the world to find him. "Can he take it?" Bran considered, eyes narrowing a fraction as if at a word whose meaning changed with the light. "Not if the fire and the river and the people stand in the right places," he said. "And not if you tell the tree your name and mean it. You've been wearing too many names for too long." He can feel the looseness. He looks for seams. Jon drew a breath in and let it out with the noise of someone who knows he has to lift something heavy and does not want to speak of it. "Then we'll give him the wrong door," he said. "Let him bang his head there while we make the one that matters smaller." By midday the yard held a scene that would have looked mad in any other year. Men were filling great tubs with oil, yes, but others were laying stone around the base of the weirwood in rings, leaving narrow gaps like the spokes of a wheel. Manderley oversaw it with the satisfaction of a man whose house had been built on mud and made to stand, and Howland Reed supervised the packing of moss between stones with a kind of quiet joy. Arya walked the perimeter with careful feet and marked places where someone could trip and break a leg at the worst moment. Davos stole salt from the kitchen in sacks and laughed at himself as he did. "Smuggling for the gods," he said. "They'll never find a bet." Eaman. At twilight, the dead came again, and with them a mist that did not belong to any weather John had known. It came from nowhere, all at once, as if a lake had been poured into the air. It muted sound and swallowed distance and made a man's breath a stranger in his own throat. Torches found themselves useless. The first trench hissed once and then steamed without flame. The dragons roared and the sound came back like a whisper that could not find a mouth. John took his place at the edge of the godswood because there are positions a man cannot delegate without breaking something in himself that will never be mended. Sansa stood on the wall above with her hair braided tight to keep it from catching in the wind's teeth. Tyrion had a place between them that was no place, close enough to shout and be heard by both, far enough to be able to run with a message if the running mattered. Missandei moved among the men with a small lamp shaded in horn and spoke in that voice that turned panic into a thing with a leash. The first whites reached the outer ring of stone and stumbled, not because of the stone but because of the thought in it. Old things resist new owners. The dead do not understand ownership except the one the cold claims. They pressed and skidded and pressed again, and when they found the gaps the living met them there with spear and arrow and the strange frog forks the crannogmen had made. The oil lit at last and ran in thin threads toward the heart tree. Where it burned, the mist lifted, unwilling to touch that kind of heat. Then the mist thickened into a shape. It did not become a man. It became the idea of a man, and inside it something colder than night moved. The heart tree's face seemed to lean forward, or perhaps it was only the idea of leaning. Bran's breath came slow and measured as he sat beneath it with one hand on the bark and one on the earth. He did not speak. John stepped once to place himself where the thing would see him first. "Me," he said, and the word made no sound and made a sound all the same. "Me." He felt the attention slide and then catch as if on a thorn. For an instant he saw, not with his eyes, a blue so absolute it emptied him. He saw a boy pinned to a tree and a knife of green stone. He saw the knife again and felt the wet cold and heard a scream that had never ended. He saw a wall going up stone by hands that believed themselves to be building a story that would keep their grandchildren sleeping. He saw a wind like a blade sharpening itself along that wall for 1,000 years. The dragons came down through the mist with their wings folded tight and their mouths open. Fire rolled over the stones and did not cross the lines. It went up in pillars and down in sheets and left the air shaking. Men who had never feared flame flinched and did not mind the shame of it. The mist boiled and then fell back, not fleeing. Annoyed, perhaps, if such a thing could feel that. When it drew away, the shape inside it took 2 steps that no feet took and stopped at the ring. Not him, John thought. Not yet. A lieutenant, then, a mind that had learned tools, perhaps, and wanted to show it. It lifted one pale hand and let it fall. The dead in the gaps surged as if pulled by string. The living answered with cursing and timing. Arya's spear flickered. Davos threw salt into a mouth that had opened for something else and laughed when it coughed it out. Ghost hit a thing that had been a wolf once but far too big and torn it into a new shape. The big dead wolf twisted and bit, and Ghost took the bite through the meat of his shoulder and did not let go until the blue went out of the eyes. John stepped through a gap before anyone could tell him not to. He met a thing in old mail and his sword found the seam at the throat where dragonglass whispers. The feel of it was not like killing a man. It was like snapping a frozen branch that had been waiting for the exact pressure to become what it had always wanted to be. He moved and moved again. The seam of his wound pulled and sang, and he ignored it. When the pale hand lifted again, the fire guttered in 2 of the channels at once, and for a moment the mist surged in and touched the bark. Bran's head came up as if someone had tugged his hair. Sansa shouted something on the wall that John did not hear. Missandei threw the lamp down and stamped it out and shouted the Nothy lines, and for a heartbeat the mist faltered, not because it understood but because everything in the world understands cadence at some level. The river, the tree, the dead thing with a memory of what it once was supposed to be. Then a sound came across the field from the north like a horn blown under ice. It made men duck and children cry and horses throw their heads in anger and fear. The pale hand lowered. The mist thinned. The shape inside turned its head as if summoned, and withdrew with no movement. The dead followed, not in panic, not in defeat, simply in obedience to a pull older than the stones beneath their feet. The fire burned itself down to blue where the oil had run thin. The air warmed all at once as if a window had been opened in a room full of smoke. Men straightened and remembered they owned spines. Women eased their hands out of fists as if they had forgotten there were fingers attached. Jon stood with his sword in his hand and felt the ash settle into his lungs and did not cough. He looked up at the wall where Sansa leaned her forearms on the stone, as if it were a table and she were about to begin the day's accounting. She met his eyes and nodded, once, and he did not need anything else from the world for that moment. Ghost pressed against his leg and shook himself and sprayed blood and meltwater and fur along Jon's knee. The wound in his shoulder would need stitching. He would let Sansa's woman do it. She had good hands. Bran's eyes rolled down to normal and he blinked as if sun had struck him, though there was none. He looked at Jon and then at the tree and then past both to a place none of them could see. "He is angry," Bran said. "He does not like that we have learned his pace. He will change it. He has turned away from us without leaving. He is thinking of the river's mouth." "White Harbor," Wyman said, summoning the name out of his chest like a curse and a prayer. "My city, my people. He means to come around us like tidewater slipping a rock." "We can't send enough men to both," Royce said, tired and sharp. "We would peel ourselves thin and he would eat what remains." Tyrion rubbed his forehead with a gloved thumb, smearing a line of soot across fur. "He thinks like a general," he said. "He thinks in flanks. We will think like a thief. We will make him believe the mouth is bait and the throat is where the meat is. We will make the mouth sharp anyway. We have ships," Wyman said. "We have men who can stand in cold water up to their chests longer than Southerners can stand in their night soil." Missandei laid her palm on the table. "I will write," she said, "to Dragonstone and to the smaller ports along the narrow sea where men own their boats and not their boats owning them. If I tell them the story properly, they'll come." She looked at Sansa. "Your coin that isn't minted yet. If we promise a cup from it to every ship that brings bread where bread is needed, you'll have the narrow sea's pride pulling oars for a tale." Sansa thought for 3 heartbeats and then nodded. "Do it," she said. "Wyman, send your fastest to White Harbor. Tell them to flood the lower warehouses and bring the boats inside the walls. Tell them to salt the streets and prepare to burn the fish so the smell confuses the dead for a day. Tell them to ring the temple of the many-faced god and the sept both and make the bells sing until their arms give out." Wyman's jaw worked. "We don't ring that temple without reason," he said. "But this is reason. My mother once told me gods are like men. They like to be asked pretty when it's important." Jon listened to them and felt the peculiar weight of not being everywhere at once settle on him like a familiar cloak. He would not leave Winterfell's tree unguarded. He could not. He would send others to the mouth, men who knew the smell of salt as breath. Davos raised his hand without waiting to be asked. "Send me," he said. "I know harbors like I know the lines on my hand. I can talk to men on piers better than I can talk to lords. No offense meant to any lord who likes his pier." He smiled. The smile made his face both older and kinder. "And if I die in a city with ships around me, that'll be a better laugh for the stranger than if I die mucking out someone's cow." "You won't die," Jon said. "You'll teach them to count without numbers, and you'll come back with curses stuck to you like barnacles and a plan." Davos nodded once and went to pack. Men from White Harbor went with him, and 2 from the Vale who had been sailors before they became men-at-arms because life does not ask permission to change. Missandei gave him letters sealed in blue wax with the mark she had chosen from among Daenerys's many. Tyrion added a set of words a man would say when a dockmaster asked him why he had to unload in the dark. That night Jon went to the Godswood alone and stood beneath the red leaves that did not need sunlight to be what they were. The weirwood did not move. The sap tears at the face had grown edges of frost that caught starlight. He put his hand to the bark and said the words Bran had told him to say. Not the words of the watch he had broken and broken again, and not the words of a man to a woman when he is trying to promise something he cannot promise. He said his name as he had always known it, and then he said the one beneath it that Bran had given back to him one cold day. He said the one he had made for himself in the hall when he told the North he would kneel to no one. He put them together without shame. The tree does not love men or hate them. It hears what it hears. He turned when he was done and found Daenerys at the edge of the clearing with her cloak drawn close and her hair flying loose for once like something living that had chosen following instead of being forced. She came no further. "I am not your enemy," she said into the air that made even words brittle. "I know," he said. "You are asking me to be less than I came to be," she said. "I am asking you to be more," he said. "To be a woman who can leave a thing down that she could carry and still be herself without it." She laughed once and the sound had a crack in it that made him want to put a hand over it like a split in a cup. "You ask well," she said. "You ask as if you know what you ask." "I do," he said. She nodded. "When the mouth of your river calls, I will go with my dragons," she said. "If I leave you here and you live, I expect to find the tree standing and the wolf still proud. If I return and find a boy pretending to be a god in its place, I will burn the boy and plant another tree." She met his eyes when she said it, and he did not flinch because he understood. She left him there and went to her dragons. He listened to the quiet they left in their wake and felt something like gratitude for its honesty. He stood until the cold went through his boots and into his bones, and then he stood longer to teach the cold that it could not have him. When he finally turned to leave, Arya stepped out of a shadow with a grin that lived more in her eyes than her mouth. "You're getting good at standing still," she said. "Might be useful when someone throws a net." "I'm bad at nets," he said. "Always have been." "Then teach your hands to be a knife that slips out." She tilted her head toward the hall. "Sansa needs you. She wants to speak of words that mean more than words." He found Sansa at the long table with the compact page before her again, but now a second sheet lay beside it. He read it without being asked and then looked up. It was a charter she was drafting for the North alone. Laws, customs put to paper, rights spoken aloud that men had always assumed were theirs but had never been promised. The first of them said, "No man may be made to fight beyond the neck without his oath freely given." The second said, "No child will be judged as a man." The third said, "Guests will be safe beneath any northern roof that opens to them, or the roof will be pulled down upon the host in punishment." "We will be ourselves," Sansa said, watching his face. "Or being ourselves will be an empty claim. If we are to be a kingdom again, we will not only be one in memory. We will be one in practice. They will know what they live by. So will we." He met her eyes and in them saw the girl he had left and the woman she had made from that girl and the cold hands that had tried to shape her and failed. He nodded. "Write it," he said. "Write it as if no one will forgive us if we get it wrong. Because they shouldn't." She smiled, quick, fierce, grateful and proud all at once, and bent to the page. On the third morning, the horn sounded from the southeast. Not the deep note of a keep in panic, but the steady call and answer of messengers passing news too important for a single voice to carry. Davos would be at the mouth now, talking to pilots and ropemen, smelling tar as comfort. The call told of sails. Not enemy, friends or something like it. The Narrow Sea had answered Missandei's letters and Sansa's coin that did not yet exist. 4 cogs from Sisterton with their sullen, salty crews, 2 Lyseni roundships, men who would sell their oars to gods if gods paid. A galley out of Gulltown with its benches empty because men had been needed for land work and a captain too loyal to stay still. With them, 3 of Wyman's own riverboats, decked with shields and the makeshift crenellations of barrels lashed with rope. Winterfell breathed. Men did that thing people do when they allow themselves to let a scrap of hope sit on their tongue before they swallow it. Jon went to the wall and looked south and saw nothing, and that was fine. He wanted to believe in the unseen for 1 hour and not hate himself for it. The hour ended. The mist gathered again. Not the same, thicker along the ground, thinner above, a cunning thing that had learned. The dead came in 2 prongs like hands, one reaching toward the godswood, one toward the east gate where the slope was easiest for a mass. The dragons went high and then dropped, and this time their fire bit cleaner. The white things answered with shards of ice that sang like steel when they struck stone. A man from Bear Island took one in the throat and fell without a sound. His sister killed the thing that had thrown it with a hammer that had belonged to her grandfather, and then she wept without tears as the cold took them from her. Bran spoke a name that was not a name, and for an instant the leaves of the heart tree seemed to shiver in a wind none of the rest of them felt. The dead nearest the trunk faltered as if the ground had tilted under them. The pale shapes at the edge of the mist paused, cocked their heads like birds, and then pressed. Not clever now, just hungry. Jon's world narrowed again. Stone under boots, breath in throat, weight of steel, the hot flare in his side when he turned too quickly. He moved along the line where men were most likely to lose the thread. He did not notice when he bled and noticed very much when someone else did. He saw Tyrion at once fetch up a discarded shield and turn it into a sled for a boy whose leg bent wrong, and he loved him then with a suddenness that needed no history to justify it. He saw Missandei get a kettle off the fire with her sleeve wrapped around her hand and throw boiling water down a narrow gap where dead fingers reached. He saw Sansa lift a bow and put an arrow where a pale eye glowed like a coin held to light. At the worst of it, each fight has a worst, and you only know it when you are already moving past it. Jon found himself in a clear circle without meaning to be, ice underfoot worn to treachery by many feet, the mist drawn back a pace by heat. The lieutenant stood there again, hand lifted, head tilted, curious. It stepped forward and then stopped with the haughty surprise of a lord told he must pay for his dinner. Arya slipped into the circle behind it with a small sound like a breath, put the tip of her spear where a back becomes a neck, and pushed. The thing shattered cleanly, in a way that made a noise like glass giving up. The mist flowed inward with a hiss that might have been grief. Arya caught Jon's wrist and pulled him out in the instant before the pieces exploded into hard sleep. "Don't stand there," she said very mildly. "Other people like you." "I forget," he said. "I know," she said, and was gone into the moving fog again. By full dark, the prong at the gods would bent and bent again and did not break. By midnight, the eastern push had slowed. By the hour before dawn, when a man's courage goes thin, the dead drew back for the space of 30 breaths and then came again, fewer, angrier. The pale shapes at the edge of the mist had been replaced by something else, a stillness that had a mind to it. Bran stirred. "Now," he whispered, and his voice moved like a thin light through a thick body. "Now he'll come to see what we are." Jon lifted his head and the hair along his neck prickled as if touched by cold fingers. He saw, through the gaps and the torches and the falling ash, a figure set back behind where the lines made sense, standing very still. He knew it without anyone telling him. He did not know how you know a storm when you see one that's different from the rest. But you do. The Night King did not move forward. He lifted one hand and the mist pressed hard enough that the front rank of the living staggered. He lowered the hand and the mist drew back beyond the trench as if leashed. He took a step, and in that step the great fire nearest him went to smoke. He did not enjoy any of it. Enjoyment is a human word. He did not hate any of it. Hate is one too. He wanted. The wanting hit Jon like cold hammered into shape. Daenerys came down out of the high cold like a stone with fire inside it. The black dragon's breath hit where the Night King had stood a heartbeat before, and heat threw the mist backward into a shape like a wall. The Night King took 3 light steps, each exactly the same as the one before, each erasing a new line of flame. The black dragon screamed and leaned hard, scales rattling. Daenerys held and learned and held again, making the fire narrow as a knife and then wide as a river. She cut him off and drove him to the right. The green dragon surged from the left, breath roaring. For an instant air, mist, fire, ice drew into a knot so tight the world seemed to stop making sense. The knot broke. The Night King moved backward without moving, and the mist poured into the empty space like blood returning to a limb. He did not retreat far. He had seen enough to satisfy a mind that has no taste but knows the meanings of pressure and time. He turned his head a fraction, and the dead, everywhere, turned with him as if attached by a fine thread. They fell back, They fell back as the tide falls back when the moon says so. They left more of themselves behind than they had left before. They took less of the living with them than they had taken the first day. That was the measure men made and called hope. No one cheered. Men sat down where they stood because their bodies would not remain standing. Women poured water and thrust bread into hands whether the hands thought they could eat or not. A boy from the rills laughed and cried at once until an older man slapped him. Not in cruelty, but to give him another sensation to cling to. The dragons beat up into the dark and were gone Lee. 'Cause streaks of night across a darker night. When the quiet had settled, Tyrion found Jon leaning against the post of a half-shattered barricade, holding the posture of a man who knows he must keep his chest open enough to take in air or his heart will begin to argue with him. Tyrion's face was black with smoke except where tears had scrubbed 2 lines clean, though Jon had not seen him cry. He held a cup and set it into Jon's hand like a ritual. "I do not know what you promised your gods," Tyrion said, "but I know what I will promise mine if we live." "I don't know that they listen," Jon said. "Then I'll promise the stones," Tyrion said dryly. "They seem to have ears, and if they don't, they at least don't answer back." They stood together a time that could have been minutes or the space between 2 breaths in a dream. Jon drank and the warmth hit his belly and spread with the benign cruelty of something that gives relief and pain at once. He watched Sansa wind down from command with the grace of a woman who has learned to be 2 people. One for the moment, one for after. He watched Arya fall into a seat that was no seat and sit perfectly still with her eyes open, a method of rest that might have been taught by ghosts to those willing to learn. He watched Missandei roll up the compact page and slide it into a tube of leather with a fastidiousness that made him trust the future in a way he had not thought possible. He watched Wyman write names on a board with chalk, rubbing each one after 3 strokes with a sleeve as if to press it into the wood. Dawn came gray and slow, like a reluctant guest. The light revealed the scars of the night and made them ordinary. The dragons returned after, smaller seeming in the daylight, which comforted no one. Daenerys slid off the black neck and stumbled once, caught herself, looked around the yard as if to remind the space that she could use it as she wished. She found Jon with ease now. Wherever he was, attention moved to him and made a clearing. She walked into it. "He knows now," she said simply. "Yes," Jon said, "and so do we." Her mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile if there had been more day in the day. "White Harbor will need you to love it very quickly," she said. "I will go with my dragons. I'll need men who can remember the sea while looking at snow. Your hand who isn't your hand has already gone." "Davos," Jon said. "He will get the ships to stand where they ought to stand, and then he'll swear at them for not being where he put them." "Good," she said. "I'll trust him with my back, and you'll trust me with your river." She studied his face, reading a map drawn in old ink. "When this is done," she added, and he could hear the coin ringing again, not yet minted. "We will speak the thing your sister wants us to sign. We will argue over it like people who intend to live with it. For now I will be your neighbor with fire, and you will be my neighbor with a tree that bites." He nodded. "Go," he said, "before he makes another door." She went. The black dragon lifted, the green followed. Their bodies wrote a new script across the morning, one the sky learned quickly because it had to. Men on the wall lifted their faces and let themselves be warmed by the wind of those wings. Jon watched until they were small and then gone. He set the cup aside and went to work. There were men to be buried and names to be put into Wyman's wood. There were lines to be redrawn and gaps to be made into places where men would not die as easily if they had to. There was a woman he had seen lose her husband who would need to be told a story that made sense of it for the space of a candle. He moved, and the day moved, and the north moved with him. At White Harbor, the mouth of the river opened to the sea with a sulk. As it often did in winter, sandbars sulking worse. Davos stood on the quays with 3 layers of wool around his country of scars and made himself a son of the place in an hour because he had never forgotten how to be that. He found Wyman's men and found their cousins and found a man with a look like a gull who knew every ripple between the bars. He spoke to them in their own language, water, pay, luck. He pointed, he listened, he lied once and then told the truth to make the lie part of the truth. Missandei's letters did their work. The Lyseni captain struck a bargain that would have been an insult in summer and was a kindness in winter. The Sisterton men grumbled as an idiom but moved when the ropes needed moving. The Gulltown galley slid where a heavier ship would have stuck and then held her place with her oarsmen's teeth gritted and their feet braced. Men salted streets and choked on it and laughed, because sometimes the only way not to weep is to pretend the world is a bad joke and you're the only one who knows the punchline. When the dead came out of the fog along the low shore, they met not open quays and welcoming streets but a tangle of masts inside the walls and water where lanes should be and fish carcasses smoking black along racks. The dragons came low and used the narrow spaces like knives. Fire became a tool rather than a scream. Men with long pikes on the quays reached and pulled, their feet slipping, their hands bleeding, their eyes bright with that particular light men carry when their city is in the balance. The Night King did not come to White Harbor himself. He did not need to. He sent the shape that would have been enough any other year, and it might have been enough now if not for cleverness and luck and the way rivers remember favor. The dead could not climb as they wished because their hands slipped on salt. Their feet could not find purchase where generous men had poured lard. The dragons set the outer quays alight and the fire ran along the wet planks as if it had been born to it. A ship from Sisterton that had come for trade and stayed for the story broke her own moorings and drifted where she'd been told to, blocking a mouth between warehouses long enough for a tide of dead to jam and then fall under their own weight. Davos stood with a line around his waist and a line in his hand and shouted at men twice his size until they did as the lines told them. He sent a boy into a boat with a coil of rope and a kiss on his head and watched him vanish into fog and reappear with a grin like a cut. He felt the old fire inside him that had loved the simple rules of ships, and he remembered to hate it a little because love is dangerous when it distracts from the work. When at last the dead fell back with the tide and the living had all their arms and legs who were going to keep them, he sat on a bollard and cried because he had used up too much of himself not to. Then he wiped his face with the back of his glove and got up because the lines would not coil themselves. Back at Winterfell, the news arrived on birds that had flown with the storm and found a way. Men lifted their heads. Wyman laughed like a man who had held a coin between his teeth and tasted the relief. Sansa closed her eyes a moment and opened them again and wrote a line at the bottom of the charter that promised to rebuild White Harbor's lower wharves with timber from the Kingswood if the South consented or with pine from the Wolfswood if it did not. Tyrion added a small line in the margin. Bring stone across on rafts come spring. Do not trust pine to remember its promises around salt. Jon took the bird to Bran, who stroked its neck with a finger and then let it go as if letting go were a skill he practiced. He is not satisfied, Bran said. He did not measure this right, and he does not like not knowing. He will come back to his first want. The tree, Jon said. The memory that outlives us, Bran said. He thinks the world is a ledger with only one page. If he can add a line there, all the other pages will go blank. Jon left Bran and went to the yard and found Tormund there teaching a boy from the Barrowlands to stand with his feet wrong and then right. The day had a tight feel to it, as if the cold had narrowed the seams of everything it touched. He spoke to the captains, the women who saw to food, the smiths whose tools never cooled. He put his hand on Ghost's head and felt the steady insistence of a life that had chosen to follow him and would do so until it could not. He waited. When the waiting ended, it ended with that terrible courtesy good enemies show one another. On time, without haste, fully meant. The mist gathered, but this time it set itself back a distance. The dead came on, and they came in an honest way, no flanks, no surprise, a pressure. The line held. The dragons moved as if they had rehearsed this beneath the earth 1,000 years. The living killed the things in front of them and did not look up for signs because signs are for afterward. And then the Night King stepped forward from his distance, and the cold went down men's throats and through their eyes and into the soft places where fear and courage decide whether to trade. He did not raise his hand. He did not need to. He looked at the tree and the bark seemed to crease with a question. Bran's fingers dug into the soil. Blood came under his nails where the cold had made skin thin. The fire rings brightened without added oil, as if memory itself had heat. Jon walked into the ring. He did not look back to see who would try to stop him. He did not speak to the Night King because there are conversations that do not require words. He lifted his sword, and it looked small in that light and large in another. He thought of his father saying a thing once at a window where a boy had watched snow. He thought of Kat's needlework and Arya's different needle and Robb's laugh when he had first knocked Jon on his back and Bran's legs around his waist when the little boy had begged to be carried. He thought of Sansa's eyes when she read a line that would change men's lives and did it anyway. He thought of the people behind him who had not chosen him but were his anyway. The Night King slid one pale step nearer, and the ground under him whitened like breath on glass. The dragons came down in a crossing, the black low, the green high, and fire made a roof and a floor. The Night King did not smile. He did not praise. He reached into the air the way a man might reach into a pocket and drew out cold. It shaped itself into a spear that was not ice and not iron and something precisely in between. He lifted it. Daenerys shifted her angle and the black dragon's wing took the line of the throw as if to say, "Me first." The spear left the Night King's hand with the infinite patience of a thing that knows it has all the time in the world. It skimmed flame without learning from it and struck the wing where it had been struck once before. The dragon lurched and screamed and did not fall. He found a new way to hold himself in the air because living things do that when death tries to teach and they are not ready to learn. Arya moved somewhere to Jon's left and then was gone. Davos was not there. He was at White Harbor teaching men to breathe with ropes in their hands. Yora was at the East Gate where a hammer hit his helm hard enough to knock the memory out of him for a heartbeat and then returned him to himself again. Missandei stood with a lamp and did her Nathi lines and taught the air a rhythm it had not known it needed. The Night King reached again and the cold shifted as if it had been asked politely. He did not throw the second spear. He drew it into a line across the earth, cutting frost as if carving a rune. Jon stepped and stepped again to keep himself between the cut and Bran, who had not moved. The frost lines met the first ring of stone and stopped as if embarrassed. "Not you," Jon said aloud now, without intending to, and the sound entered his own ears as if spoken by someone he knew long ago. "Not here." He lunged and the sword struck, and the sound it made was like ice deciding to be water again. The Night King lifted two fingers very delicately, and the fire in one of the channels bent without going out, like a man who bows when he has to and then straightens. He tilted his head, considering, and then he looked at Jon, and in that look Jon felt for the first time. Not in memory, not in prophecy, the shape of how it might end. There are victories that are only beginnings. There are endings that are not defeats. He held the Night King's attention with his body, with his breath, with his plain, stubborn being. Behind him, Sansa spoke to two men at once and turned them into four who did the right thing at the right time. Behind him, Arya placed a thing where a foot would go a second from now and turn death into a stumble. Behind him, Bran sat with his hand on bark and his mind in a river that did not know time. Behind him, the North held. The Night King took one slow step back. He had learned something. He does not like learning, Bran had said. He will change the pace. The pale figure lifted his hand, not high, not theatrically, a note in a song. The dead fell back, not broken, not satisfied, banking their hunger like a man banks a fire against dawn. The mist unrolled across the field and lay down as if to sleep. The wind returned, persuasive, ordinary. The stars came out in a sky that had the good manners to pretend it had not been watching any of this. Men lowered their weapons with the guilty relief men feel when given permission to continue living. Jon stood and felt the heat of the rings on his shins and the cold in his back and the needle-thin ache along the seam of his wound. He lowered his sword and did not sheath it. He looked up and found Sansa's eyes again where he knew they'd be, on him and beyond him, weighing what had to be weighed. She nodded once and he nodded back, and for a breath the world was simple. "Eat," he told the nearest men, and they did, because a voice had given them the small mercy of an order that did not ask for anything they had not already given. He turned and put his palm to the bark. It was cold and slightly damp, like a stone that has been rained on long ago and remembers it. He did not pray. He did the human equivalent of it. He made a promise out loud to something that might or might not keep it for him. Then he went to see to Ghost's shoulder and to speak to a woman whose son had not come back and to tell Tyrion he would have to write fewer letters and more lines on Sansa's charter because their lives needed a framework now that wasn't fire and ice. It would not be over tomorrow. It would not be over when the Night King chose the next door and found it barred as this one had been. It would not be over when White Harbor's smoke blew out and the lower wharves dried with salt crystals crisping along their eaves. It would be over when the river finished the thought it had begun beneath the tree 1,000 years ago, and when men decided to listen to it or not. Jon walked into the next hour as if it were a room he had helped to build. He did not kneel. He did not call himself a king. He did not need to. The north, bruised and cold and very much itself, moved with him. The dragons, far to the south and high to the north, cut their paths into the sky and learned the winter's language more fluently each day. The dead, patient and offended, gathered themselves for a different shape of pressure. And day by day, while the long work of killing and not being killed went on, the other work went on too. Ink dried, seals cooled, coins that did not yet exist took on their weight inside men's imaginations. Sansa wrote a line that outlawed debt bondage within the north and a line that made a widow's house her own to dispose of without a man's hand on the key. Wyman outlawed certain tricks of salt merchants with a satisfaction that tasted of old grudges and good policy both. Howland Reed showed boys a way to cut rushes on the marsh that yielded baskets tight enough to hold oil, and then taught them why to use the oil and why not to when it would be waste. Missandei drilled a dozen girls to read the numbers for grain and to challenge a steward if the measure did not weigh true. Tyrion found, with a strange feeling that might have been contentment, that his cleverness had been hired to support survival rather than performance. One evening of a week that had begun with a scream and ended with a laugh, Arya sat by the well with Needle on her knees and her face composed, and Gendry leaned on his hammer and said nothing, and that was the conversation they needed. Yora, having taken a dent to his armor that would show forever, asked Lyanna what story she wanted told about her if she died. Lyanna said, "The one where I told a man the truth and he did not cry." They both smiled at that. Bran, at the foot of the tree, whispered once, only once, the name of a woman who had lain in blood and winter flowers and given him the part of the world that would let him know it without being swallowed. The tree heard or did not. The river spoke or did not. The wind passing through the branches made a sound like pages turning, which is as much answer as anyone ever receives. The Night King did not come the next day, or the one after. He went where rivers braided into themselves and where harbors had learned to fight. He probed and tested and measured like a craftsman who despises imperfection but has run out of perfect. Winterfell breathed in those days, as a tired house breathes when a mother opens the shutters and lets out old smoke. Men sharpened their blades and slept without sleeping and dreamed without rest and woke to the sight of the tree and the wall and the work and found that enough. Jon took his meals in the hall when he could, and the men and women of the north glanced at him and away in the manner of people who have decided to follow someone and don't want to embarrass him by staring. He ate slowly because that was how you make food into fuel and not a folly in days like this. He spoke little because he had a finite number of words and wanted to spend them where they would do work. When he did speak, it was often a small thing to a single person that turned into a great thing in the mouth of others. He learned to do that without shame. Kings do it, and cooks. He was not a king. He was a man with a tree, a river, a city with salt in its lungs, a sister with ink in her fingers, a sister with a knife, a brother who sat between time and bark, a friend who moved boats by talking to the men who pulled their ropes, a woman with dragons who had agreed to be a neighbor for now and perhaps something else when the coin cooled. In the deep winter hour before the true morning, a cry went up from the far north side. Not fear, but warning with awe salted into it. Jon climbed the stair with Ghost at his heel and came to the parapet and looked out. The aurora had come south. Long green curtains draped from some invisible rod, shifting as if a goddess shook them to remove dust. The sky wore it without shame. Men stood with their mouths slightly open and women with tears on cold cheeks that had nothing to do with sorrow. The dead would come. The dead would always come until they did not. For a single measured slice of time, the north looked up and saw a color that had never been a sword or a fire or a bruise. They held it in their chests and could not be robbed of it after. John watched until the light thinned and then returned to blue. He put his hand on the stone and felt in it a steadiness that belonged to no man. He took a breath that did not hurt. He turned to go find Sansa because she would be awake, to listen to Bran because the river might have said something in the night, to walk the yard because his feet told him to. He did not kneel. He did not wear a crown. He went on.